Yo boys, DDB here, and the War Within is almost at our doorsteps. And with it, each class will be given something new called Hero Talents. Once you start your leveling journey, you'll start to gain talent points as you level up that will unlock new things like your cool new abilities, utility, and some passives. Each spec will have two options to choose from when it comes to Hero Talents. What I'm going to be doing today is giving you an overview of each of the melee DPS Hero Talent classes within the game, and try to help you make your decision on what you want to play. This is going to be based on what I found cool and interesting in my opinion. We're mainly going to be focusing on talents that have flavour to them, so ones that help you out your rotation, and ones that have also cool new buttons, etc., and just feel good to play in general. So first up, we're going to have a look at some of the warrior hero talents, and we're going to look at Colossus. Colossus, for arms warriors, it's going to give you an ability called Demolish. It'll be a channeling spell that just does a bunch of damage to whatever you're targeting, and then it will do reduced damage to any enemies within 8 yards. Demolish's damage can be further increased with something called Colossal Might, which is going to increase the damage dealt by your Demolish by 10%. It'll stack up to 5 times, and you'll be able to stack this up with abilities like Mortal Strike, Executes, and your Cleaves. You also summon on the last node of your hero talents called Dominus of the Colossal. That will now increase the stack count from 5 to 10, and every time that you have maximum stacks, instead of gaining a stack, you instead reduce the cooldown of your Demolish by 2 seconds. Also increase the target's damage it takes from you by 10%, based on the amount of stacks you have Colossal Might. So if you have 10 stacks, this will be 50% damage increase. So it's just a very hard hitting button currently. So for the next hero talent, it will be Slayer. You can gain this as Arms and Fury Warrior. Fortunately for this, you don't actually get any new buttons, but you do get a bunch of cool new passives. So the top node is Slayer's Dominance. This will just give your attacks a high chance to strike again with something called Slayer Strike, and it will apply a mark to the target, increasing the damage they take from your executes by 15% and stacking up to 3 times. There's a cool passive also on the left hand side called Imminent Demise. That makes so every 3 Slayer strikes will give you a sudden death proc, which will be an execute. Sudden death also accelerates your next Blade Storm, striking 1 additional time, up to a maximum of 3. Also another node called Show No Mercy, which makes your marks increase the critical strike chance and critical strike damage of your next execute on the target by 15%. And then for the capstone for this, it'll be Unrelenting Onslaught, which will make it so when you execute a target that's already marked, you both reduce the cooldown of your Blade Storm by 5 seconds and apply 2 stacks of Overwhelm. Per stack of mark for executioners is consumed. Overwhelming is it's a node just below the Slayer's Dominance, which makes it so each time you strike with your Blade Storm, it applies Overwhelm to the targets, increasing the damage you deal to them by 1% for 20 seconds, and then it stacks up to 12 times. So as you can tell, Slayer's all about executing, and then also mixing in your Blade Storms as well. So if you do enjoy just slamming executes and doing a bunch of damage, this is definitely a good one for you. And then last for the hero DPS talents for Warrior is going to be Mountain Thane. This you can only spec as Fury Warrior. Mountain Thane's all about your Thunderclaps. First node will be Lightning Strike, which will make it so when you Thunderclap, Raging Blow or Execute has a chance to strike down the target with a Lightning Bolt, dealing a bunch of nature damage. And also this Lightning Strikes can occur 30% more often whilst you're in Avatar. There's also a passive node called Thunder Blast. This will make it so your Shield Slam and Bloodthirst have a 35% chance to grant you Thunder Blast instead, which will just turn your Thunderclap into something called Thunder Blast, which will just be an empowered Thunderclap. There's also a node on the right hand side called Burst of Power, which will make it so your Lightning Strikes have a 15% chance to make your next 2 Bloodthirsts have no cooldown, deal damage, and generate additional rage. So this will just lead you to just pressing Bloodthirst a bunch of times in a row, rather than just waiting out the cooldown. And then for the capstone of this will be called Avatar of the Storm, which will make it so when you cast your Avatar, you'll gain 2 charges of your Thunder Blast, and it will reset the cooldown of your Thunderclap instantly. And then whilst your Avatar is not active, your Lightning Strikes have a 10% chance to grant you your Avatar for 4 seconds. So yeah, if you do enjoy the Thunderclap spell, and it's got pretty cool visuals on this with Mountain Thane, I'm sure you'll enjoy this one. Next we're going to look at Enhancement Shaman. The Enhancement Shaman will have 2 hero talents. First one being Stormbringer. Stormbringer will come with a spell called Tempest, which makes so every time you spend your Maelstrom, it will replace your Lightning Bolt with a spell called Tempest. It'll just be like a really hard hitting ability that will deal damage to your target and any target within 8 yards. Stormbringer is going to be mainly focusing on giving you damage through your nature and also increasing the damage of things like your Lightning Bolt, Chain Lightnings, etc. Whilst also offering you extra stat increases for when you do spend things like your Maelstrom. The capstone for Stormbringer is something called Awakening Storms. This will just allow your Storm Strike, Lightning Bolt, and Chain Lightnings to have a chance to strike a target for 200% of the spell power damage. Every 3 times this occurs, your next Lightning Bolt will also be replaced with a Tempest. So like I said, this will just turn your lightning bolts, etc., into just very hard hitting spells, and it'll also give you like a new ability called Tempest that will just hit even harder. So the second enhancement hero talent is something called Totemic. As you can imagine, this is going to be based around all around your totems. So if the first thing you'll be gaining is something called Surging Totem, this will be something that you place at your target location that will just cause tremors. It'll just do a bunch of damage to whatever's in the area. On the right hand side, just below that, we have something called Lively Totems. It will state that Lava Lash has a chance to summon a Searing Totem to hurl Searing Bolts that will do a bunch of damage to your target and anything that's nearby. So once again, it's just adding more totems. Below that also, to do with your Searing Totems, we have something called Reactivity. This will allow your Frost Shocks to empower your Hailstorm, Lava Lash, and Fire Nova, causing your Searing Totems to shoot out Searing Volleys up to nearby targets. So for the capstone, we'll be gaining something called Whirling Elements. This will just make it so orbs spawn around your Surging Totem, and your abilities will consume these motes with effects based on what you're playing, so Enhancement, Elemental, Restoration, etc. So if it's an air spell for enhancement, your next Storm Strike will do additional damage and hit one nearby target for 75% of the effectiveness. If it's an earth spell, it makes it so casting Sundering or Elemental Blast will refund 12 seconds from its cooldown. And if it's a fire spell, it will increase the critical strike chance of your next Fire Nova or Lava Lash by 25% and increase its critical strike damage by 75%. So yeah, like I said, this hero talent is just going to be basing around you putting totems everywhere and gaining like passives from them, and yeah, then just kind of crapping out a bunch of damage. Next up, we're going to have a look at the rogue hero talents. So first is Deathstalker. This is shared by Sub Rogue and Assassination Rogue. Top node for this is called Deathstalker's Mark. For Sub, you'll be proccing this with Shadow Strike, and for Assassination, we'll be proccing this with Ambush. So this reads that your Ambush or Shadow Strike, depending on what spec you're playing, from Stealth applies Deathstalker Mark, and when you spend combo points against the mark target, it deals like extra damage, and it will consume the Deathstalker Mark. This will also increase the damage of your Ambush or Shadow Strike also by up to 40%, but the only thing with this is you can only have one mark target at a time. A lot of the passives on this hero talent tree will just be giving you extra damage. There is also a node called Shadewalker, which each time you consume a Deathstalker mark, it will reduce the cooldown of your Shadow Step by 3 seconds. So if you like bouncing around a lot with Shadow Step, this is definitely a good point to take. But yeah, there's not a whole lot about this hero talent, it's just kind of like applying marks and then just removing the marks to do increased damage and buffing your other abilities. Next is Trickster. This is shared by Subtlety and by Outlaw. So the first node is Unseen Blade. It will cause your primary combo point generator to also strike with an unseen blade, and it will apply something now called a phase to the target. Phased enemies will take 5% more damage from you and can't parry your attacks. So a lot of the nodes on here are basing around this phased effect, with you doing increased damage to them and them like not doing as much damage to you, etc. And then for the last node on here, which is Coup de Grace, this will work with your unseen blade and cause your next Eviscerate for Subtlety and Dispatch for Outlaw to perform a Coup de Grace, which will cause you to perform a Coup de Grace, and it will function as if you've got 5 additional combo points. Also, if your target's phased, you gain 5 stacks of Flawless Form. Flawless Form will be proccing from again your Unseen Blade, and it will increase the damage from your finishing moves by 3% for 12 seconds. So again, a lot of this is kind of passive, other than the last one with being Coup de Grace, but yeah. And then lastly, we have Fatebound. This is shared by Assassination Rogue and for Outlaw. So the top node will be something called Hand of Fate. This will make it so you flip a coin each time you use a finishing move that consume 5 or more combo points. So you can roll heads or you can roll tails with this. Heads will increase the damage from your attacks by 10%, and it will last for 15 seconds until you flip the coin again to tails. And if you flip it to tails, it will just deal a bunch of extra damage to the target. But each time you flip the coin and you continue to get either heads or tails continuously, it will continue increasing the effect. So if you keep flipping heads, you'll keep getting a damage increase, and if you just keep flipping tails in a row, like 3 times in a row, then the cosmic damage that it's going to be dealing to the target is just going to get bigger and bigger. So as you can imagine with a coin flip hero talent, it's very RNG. There is also moments where you can gain both effects at the same time, with something called Edge Case, which means that after you activate your major cooldown ability, it'll cause your Fatebound coins to land on its edge, counting as both heads and tails. And then for the capstone here, we have something called Fateful Ending. This states that when you flip the coin the same face for 7 times in a row, you'll keep the lucky coin to gain 7% additional agility until you leave combat for 10 seconds. And if you already had a lucky coin, it instead deals a bunch of extra damage to your target. So yeah, this spec just all about the coin flips and you either getting heads or tails. You might want, heads in some situations and tails in other situations, but it's all going to come down to RNG. There are a couple of talents that will help you with this, like the edge case, but other than that, yeah, a lot of RNG involved in it. Next up, we have Retribution Paladin. This will have two hero talents, and the first one we'll be covering is Herald of the Sun. So the first node for this will be something called Dawn Light. This will state that when you cast your Wake of Ashes, it causes your next two Holy Power spenders' abilities to apply a Dawn Light to your target, dealing a bunch of extra spell damage and radiant healing over 8 seconds. This will also do a little bit of extra damage to targets that are close by. There are nodes on here like Sunseer, which will cause your Hammer of Wrath Divine Storm crits to also burn the target for radiant damage over 4 seconds. So it just kind of gives you a couple extra dots when your abilities are critting. There's also a node in the middle of the tree called Blessing of the Anshi. I'm probably not pronouncing that right to be honest with you, but yeah. This will just make it so your healing and damage over time effects increase the damage of your next Hammer of Wrath by 200%. So it just turns this button into like a really hard hitting ability. Towards the bottom left side of the tree, we've got something called Aurora, which means that after you cast your Wake of Ashes, you'll gain Divine Purpose. So Divine Purpose will make it so your next Holy Power ability is free and it will deal 10% increased damage. This will be things like your Divine Storm and your Templar Verdict. For the capstone for this, we've got something called Sun's Avatar. This will just make it so that when your Avenging Wrath is active, you're just dealing a bunch of extra splash damage to targets nearby, and then when you do activate Avenging Wrath, it applies up to 4 Dawn Lights to nearby allies or enemies and increases your Dawn Light duration by up to 20%. So yeah, a lot of this is passive, with you gaining like procs from like your Divine Purpose during your Wake of Ashes, and then it just kind of functions around having a couple of extra dots and just dealing burn damage basically. So for the second option we have as Rep Paladin, it's going to be Templar. Templar will gain you an extra button instead of your Wake of Ashes, which will be Hammer of Light. This is given through a talent called Light's Guidance, and it will make it so that your Wake of Ashes will replace your Hammer of Light for 12 seconds after you first cast it. So the Hammer of Light is just basically a hard-hitting nuke on the target, and it will also splash to 4 nearby targets. Wake of Ashes obviously has quite a short cooldown with 30 seconds, so you'll be able to use this fairly often. There's also something called Shake the Heavens. This will make it so your Hammer of Light calls down an Imperial Hammer on targets every 2 seconds for 8 seconds. Hammer of Light's do quite a few things here, and a lot of the talents are actually based on it. Things like Undisputed Ruler, which make it so your Hammer of Lights apply Judgment to its target and increase your haste by 12%. So these hammers are just kind of doing a bunch of extra damage whilst also buffing you when they're doing damage. And then for our capstone, we've got something called Light's Deliverance. This will just make it so when your Imperial Hammers are doing damage, you're going to be gaining stacks of Light's Deliverance. And whilst your Wake of Ashes and Hammer of Lights are available, you consume 60 stacks of this Light's Deliverance, empowering yourself to cast Hammer of Light an additional time, but instead this time it will be free of cost, so it won't cost any holy power. So yeah, this build just functions around like hammers constantly dealing damage. You've got your hard hitting button with Hammer of Light. So yeah, just a big hammer build of this really. Now we're going to move on to Windwalker Monk. This also has two hero talents, and the first we're going to be covering is Conduit of the Celestials. Conduit of the Celestials comes with a new button called Celestial Conduit. This will just be a button that you press that you kind of just sit into a meditating state, and it'll be a channel that you can move around in, and it'll deal a bunch of damage. To single targets it does more, and then it also cleaves extra targets, but it'll be kind of split between them. There's a node on here called Restore Balance. This will make it so that when your Zuen is active, you'll be gaining Rushing Jade Wind, which is just an extra bit of AoE that you can do. Below this we have Flight of the Red Crane, which just makes it so when you Rushing Jade Wind and Spinning Crane Kick deal damage, call forth Chi-Ji to increase your energy regeneration rate by 20% for 6 seconds, and then also the Chi-Ji will also rush to the targets and deal a bunch of extra damage. There's also a node called Strength of the Black Ox, which just makes it so that after Zuen has assisted you, your next Blackout Kick will refund 2 stacks of Teaching in the Monastery, and cause you to spawn a Nizal to stomp at your target's location. On the left hand side we have something called Heart of the Jade Serpent. This will just make it so that when you've consumed 45 Chi, it causes the next strike of the Windlord to call forth Yulon to decrease the cooldown time of your Rising Sun Kick, Fist of Fury, and Strike of the Windlord, and also Whirling Dragon Punch by 75%. So it just means you can cast them more often. And this will also make it so the Fist of Fury cast time is reduced by 50% whilst Yulon is active. So as you can kind of tell so far, A lot of this is just based on you summoning your Celestials and then just buffing you and doing extra damage for you. For the last node in here, we've got something called Unity Within. This will just make it so that Celestial Conduit can be recast once you're in your meditating state, and it will call forth all of your Celestials to aid you at 200% effectiveness. You can either call them forth as you're channeling this, or you can wait until the button completely channels, and then at the end of the cast, they'll come forth and help you. So if you enjoy like your kind of like a pet style kind of thing, this will be really good for you. It also gives you a bunch of benefits to helping you with your rotation. So yeah, currently it's really good. Next we've got Shado-Pan for the Windwalker Monk. Shado-Pan will focus around something called Flurry Strikes. This will just make it so that every time you're pressing your buttons, you're gaining something called a Flurry Charge. And for each 300 energy that you spend, you'll unleash all of the charges, dealing a bunch of extra damage. Shadowpan's going to be mainly focused around passive abilities that will just kind of increase your flat like damage. So things like Masteral Precision, it will just increase your attack penetrations on armor by 12%. You've got things like One versus Many, which increase the Fist of Fury damage by 15%. And then things like Against All Odds, which will just make it so your Flurry Strikes increase your agility by 1%, stacking up to 20 times. So yeah, Shadowpan, very passive tree. There's not really much you need to think about when you're doing anything. It kind of just happens as you're doing your rotation. For the capstone for this, we've got something called Wisdom of the Wall. This will just make it so that every 10 flurry strikes become infused with something called Wisdom of the Wall, gaining one of the following effects for 20 seconds. So you either gain 30% critical strike damage, you'll gain dodge and critical strike chance increased by 25% of your versatility bonus, you'll buff your flurry strikes by up to 160%, and they'll also be doing shadow damage, or it will instead increase your mastery by 25%. So yeah, like I said, a lot of this is just passive and just happens. Next up we've got Survival Hunter. This will have two hero talents, with it being Pack Leader and Sentinel. First we're going to have a look at Pack Leader. So Pack Leader will kind of just focus around your pets doing damage, or doing more damage at least. So the first thing we have on this list is something called Vicious Hunt. Vicious Hunt will cause your kill command to then ready your pet for the next kill command it's going to cast, and increase its damage by up to 200%. This, we also have a talent called Pack Coordination, causing on your next target that you've hit with your kill command from your Vicious Hunt, which will then cause your pet to do another basic attack alongside your Raptor Strike. So with this build, it's kind of just focusing a lot around your pets, like I said, and your ability kill command. There's a talent called Frenzied Tear, which will help you out even more with this. It will make it so your pet's attack have a 20% chance to reset the cooldown of your kill command, and strike for an additional time at 30% of the normal damage. There's also something here called Beast of Opportunity, causing your Coordinate Assault, which is your main cooldown, to call forth pets from your stable every 6 seconds. And then for the capstone, we have something called Pack Assault, which will cause your Vicious Hunt and Pack Coordination to now stack and apply twice, and these are always active during your Coordinated Assault. So yeah, as the hero talent states, Pack Leader, it's just all going to be about your pets. The second hero talent, we have something called Sentinel. Unfortunately, again, Survival Hunters didn't really get a good role on their hero talents, and they don't have anything for like extra buttons. And Sentinel is going to be kind of like a passive hit thing again. So for the very first talent, we have something actually called Sentinel, which will just cause your attacks to have a chance to spawn a Sentinel at your target's location, and this will stack up to 10 times. These Sentinels are just basically owls that are going to be constantly dealing damage to the targets, and if the stack count reach 3, applying a Sentinel again will have a chance to trigger an explosion. So a lot of the nodes here are just all basing around the Sentinel either doing more damage or buffing you in some sort of way. Things like Invigorating Pulse, which states that every time that your Sentinel deals damage, it'll have a chance to gain you 5 focus. And then there are other talents that will just be increasing the damage it's actually doing. And then other talents that will also just increase the stat counts, so it'll just make it so that they implode a lot more often. There is a node towards the bottom, however, called Symphonic Arsenal, that will just make it so that your Butchery discharges arcane energy, so it will just be doing extra damage upon pressing Butchery. For the capstone for this, we have something called Lunar Storm. So this will just make it so that every 15 seconds when you press Wildfire Bomb, it'll summon a Celestial Owl at the target location. And it's kind of similar to the old Night Fae ability that they used to have, where they used to kind of plunk it down and then it just deals like extra damage. And on top of that, any target that's currently hit by Lunar Storm will have their damage taken increased by up to 10%. So again, this build's just kind of all passive, you don't need to worry about it too much. The owls just kind of like happen as you're doing damage, but some of the visuals on this are definitely pretty cool. Now we have Feral Druid.
This again will have two hero talents for it. First being Druid of the Claw. Druid of the Claw will gain you a new ability called Ravage. This will just make it so your auto attacks have a chance to make your next Ferocious Bite become Ravage instead. So this Ravage will basically just be a buff Ferocious Bite that will deal a bunch of extra damage, and it will also cleave to targets in front of it. So it adds like a cleaving component to Ferocious Bite. There are also talents like Dreadful Wound that will cause your Ravage to also inflict bleeds to any targets that it hits by up to 70%, and it will also reduce the damage that they deal to you by a small amount. So a lot of the capstones here are just kind of to do with Ravage, and other ones are just kind of like increasing your survivability mainly. You also got things that will buff your utility, like Pax Endurance, that will just make it so your stampeding rules duration is increased by 25%. But other than that, yeah. But for the capstone node on this, it's going to be something called Claws Rampage. This will just make it so that during your Berserk, your Shred, Swipe, and Thrash have a 25% chance to make your next Ferocious Bite become Ravage. So during your cooldowns, you're just going to have a even bigger uptime on gaining Ravages, just dealing more damage. And for the second option we have for Feral Druid, it's going to be Wildstalker. Wildstalker's just going to be about dealing more and more dot damage. So for the first node we have is called Thriving Growth. This will just make it so that your bleeds with Rip and Rake damage have a chance to spawn a vine at your target that will deal a bunch of extra bleed damage. With a lot of the nodes here just kind of increasing your bleed damage, so like things like a Rip, Rake, Thrash, etc. will kind of just be buffed. So yeah, this build just kind of functions around just doing more and more dot damage. So if you enjoy just kind of dealing a bunch of your damage through dots rather than just direct damage, Wildstalker is definitely a good choice. And for the last node on here, it's something called Vigorous Creepings. Any targets affected by your vines, you'll be doing increased damage to them. So to be honest, this is probably one of the more lackluster ones. You know, just dots are happening as you're just playing the game, and unfortunately the capstone for this is kind of just one of the more lackluster ones, to be honest. Right, let's get into Demon Hunters now. Again, these will have two hero talents. Let's first looking at Aldrachi Reaver. Aldrachi Reaver will give you a new ability called Reaver's Glaive. You'll be gaining this ability from Soul Shards. So when you consume up to 6 Soul Shards, you'll be gaining the ability called Reaver's Glaive. This will be put in place of Throw Glaive, and it will just be cast once. So this glaive will just be like a buffed version of Throw Glaive, and then when you press it, it'll enhance your next Chaos Strike or Blade Dance. It also states that the enhanced ability that you press first will do 10%, and then the second one will be doing 20% increased damage. So depending on if you want more AoE or more single target, you'll be pressing either one first. So the main talent point of this hero talent, which is actually just off to the side and kind of just like a passive, but you kind of have to do something to proc it, is something called Reaver's Mark. This just make it so that when you've got enhanced attacks from your Reaver's Glaive, so your Chaos Strike and your Blade Dance, they'll apply something called a Reaver's Mark, causing the target to take up to 7% increased damage for 20 seconds upon pressing your Chaos Strike. However, if you cast Blade Dance first and then a Chaos Strike after, the Reaver's Mark is instead increased by up to double the amount. So with this build, you're just going to be wanting to have Reaver's Mark up on the same target as much as possible. Things like Wounded Quarry that are below this will just make it so that your Reaver's Mark on a target have a chance to do an extra bit of damage to the target, and it will also have a chance to shatter a soul, just feeding into you being able to press Reaver's Glaive more and having more markup times. However, on AoE, there is something called Fury of the Aldrachi. This just make it so when you enhanced Reaver's Glaive Blade Dance, will cast 3 additional glaives slashes to the targets, and then if it's cast second after Chaos Strike, it'll instead deal 6 slashes. For the capstone of this, we have Thrill of the Fight. This will just make it so that after you consuming both of your enhancements, you'll gain Thrill of the Fight, increasing your attack speed by 15% and increasing your healing by 20%. So yeah, like I say, with this build, you're kind of just trying to shatter souls as much as possible, and then collect them, press the glaive, and then just either trying to buff your Chaos Strike or your Blade Dance, depending on if you're in AoE or single target. Second hero talent, we have Fel-Scarred. Fel-Scarred will be all about you being in your metamorphosis state as much as possible, and also buffing some of your abilities whilst inside it. So for the first node, we have something called Demon Surge. This will just make it so that your Demon's Bite will generate 15% additional fury. Also, whilst your Demon form is active, the first cast of each of your empowerment abilities induces a Demon Surge, causing you to implode and felt energy to nearby targets. So your Demon Surge will actually proc from things like your Eye Beam, your Sigil, your Immolation Aura, and during your metamorphosis, at least when you've pressed the button, you'll only gain like 1 stack of the Demon Surge, so you can't constantly be pressing Eye Beams and just gaining Demon Surges. That will only happen once. So like I said, the Demon Surges are also AoE, but there's a talent node below this called Focus Hatred that makes it so if your Demon Surge only hits one target, it will instead deal 50% increased damage to that single target. So this hero talent actually felt really nice to play, as you're just constantly pressing buttons, as you're just gaining so much fury, and there are also nodes here that will increase the amount of actual overall fury that you'll have, just making the rotation a lot more smoother in my opinion, at least for the no mover build. I'll also give you some passive from things like Burning Blades, causing your Chaos Strike, Throw Glaive, and your auto attacks to deal an additional 60% fire damage as like a dot. And for the capstone for this, we have Demonic Intensity. Let's just make it so when you activate your Metamorphosis, you greatly empower your Eye of Beam, Immolation Aura, and your Sigil of Flame, like I said before. And then each time that you proc one of these, your Demon Surge damage will be increased by 10%. So you want to try to get out all of the abilities that were listed during your main Metamorphosis in order to do as much Demon Surge damage as possible. And last but not least, we have Death Knights. So Death Knights will first look at Deathbringer. Deathbringer will be for Frost decays, and you'll gain a new ability called Reaper's Mark. This will be an ability that you press that will cost 2 runes, and it will do a bunch of Shadow Frost damage to the target, and it will also apply Reaper's Mark. This will just make it so that when you're dealing Shadow or Frost damage, it'll add a stack of Reaper's Mark, and after 12 seconds, or at least reaching 40 stacks, the mark explodes, dealing a bunch of extra damage. Reaper's Mark will also just go to another target if the target dies, or if it explodes when the target's below 35% health. There's a talent here called Wave of Souls that will just cause you to do Frostfire damage after your Reaper's Mark. It will just cause any target that's in the way of the waves to take increased damage. When the Waves of Soul do crit on a target, they cause the enemy to take 5% increased Shadow Frost damage for 15 seconds, and this will stack up to 2 times, meaning a 10% damage increase. The wave actually always crits as well when it's on its way back to you as well. So yeah, this hero talent is all just about applying marks to targets and making them explode, and yeah, Wave of Souls as well, dealing a bunch of extra damage to targets whilst also increasing the amount of damage they take from you. The capstone for this, we have something called Exterminate. This will just make it so that after your Reaper's Mark explodes, your next Obliteration will have a rune reduction, and it will summon a Scythe to strike your enemies. This Scythe will have a chance to apply Reaver's Mark to the target, and then the second time that it's going to be dealing damage, it'll do a bunch of extra damage once again, and it will also apply Frost Fever. So this kind of just loops into itself of constantly like marking targets and then spawning the Scythe. So yeah, very cool hero talent in my opinion, just constantly feeding into more and more marks, enabling you to spawn these Scythes that are also doing a bunch of damage. Whilst again, Wave of Souls will also be happening during this and increasing the damage that targets are taking whilst also doing a bunch of the damage on its own. So the next hero talent will be Riders of the Apocalypse. This will be shared by both Frost and Unholy DK. So the first node for this will be called Riders Champion. This will just make it so that when you spend runes, you have a chance to call forth a Horseman for 10 seconds. This will call forth either one of 4 Horsemans, being Morgraine, Whitemane, Trollbane, or Nazgrim, and they all do different things. Morgraine will cast Death and Decay at his location that follows the position. Whitemane will cast an ability called Undeath on a target, dealing a bunch of extra Shadow Frost damage, and each time it deals damage it will be gaining a stack, increasing its damage even further. Trollbane will cast Chains of Ice on the target, slowing their movement by 40% and increasing the damage they take from you by 5%. And then finally we have Nazgrim. While Nazgrim is active, you'll be gaining something called Apocalyptic Conquest that will increase your strength by 3%. So a node just below this is actually pretty cool. It doesn't really do anything for your DPS. Instead helps out the utility and the movement problem for DKs. So you can either choose from one or two things, which will be either on a Power Horse or Death Charge. So on a Power Horse, it will make it so that when you're outdoors, you're able to mount your Death Charger whilst in combat. And then we have Death's Charge, which is a similar thing. Instead, it will remove your Death's Advance, and it'll be sort of like a Paladin horse that you can press. This will break any like movement impairment effects on you, and this will last for 10 seconds. So yeah, very cool piece of utility in my opinion, as this is just like a normal mount going at 100% increased movement speed, and it just lasts a long time, like 10 seconds, quite a long time to have 100% increased move speed. Other than that, for the damage side of things in this tree, they're all just basing around the horsemen, dealing a bunch of extra damage whilst also increasing your damage and your stats. Things like Nazgrim's Conquest, where if targets die while Nazgrim's active, the strength of your Apocalyptic Conquest is increased by 3%. And there are also other like nice pieces of utility talents with things like Horseman's Aid, which just make it so that while your Horsemen are out, they have a chance to spawn an anti-magic shell on you and themselves for 80% effectiveness, just making you even more tanky. With the capstone talent of this being Apocalypse Now, this will just make it so that when you cast Army of Dead or your Frostworm Fury, depending on if you're Frost or Unholy, it'll call forth all 4 horsemen at once for 20 seconds. So you can have them all out with all the benefits that they reap. So the last hero talent we're going to be covering is Lane. This will be Unholy specifically. Lane will make it so that you'll be gaining something called Vampiric Strike, causing your Death Coil Epidemic and your Death Strike to have a 10% chance to make your next Scourge Strike become a Vampiric Strike. The Vampiric Strike will heal you for 2% of your maximum health and grant you an Essence of the Blood Queen, increasing your haste by 1% up to 5% for 20 seconds. So yeah, it's just like a buffed version of your normal Scourge Strike that will also be healing you and giving you a stat increase. So for a lot of the hero talents here, as you can imagine, it's all about like the blood magic kind of thing, with you being able to heal more with the Lane. Things like Vampiric Aura will just increase your leech by 2%. There are also talents that will help you out in your rotation with things like Infliction of Sorrow. It'll just make it so that when your Vampiric Strike does deal damage to a target, it extends the duration of your diseases on them by 3 seconds. So this will just help you keep your diseases on the target further. For the capstone of this, we have something called Gift of the Lane. This will just make it so that when you have your Dark Transformation, which will be your pet, active, you'll gain something called Gift of the Lane. This will just make it so that your Essence of the Blood Queen is increased by 100%, and your Vampiric Strike will be replaced by a Scourge Strike for the duration of the buff. So yeah, during your cooldowns, you'll just constantly have Vampiric Strike. So for this hero talent, it doesn't really give you like an extra button per se. It kind of just replaces one of your buttons with another button, and just gains you like enhanced effects on it. Yeah, guys, that was my look at the hero talents for the melee going into the War Within. Comment down below what hero talents you're looking forward to going into the War Within. I'm going to be covering the range section in another video. But other than that, as always, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.